Rain came down on Corasont in silver chains, striking the black shoulders of the Jedi temple and breaking apart into pale fragments that the wind snatched away before they could become puddles. Far below, the traffic ways burned in streaming bands of amber, white, and sullen red. The city did not sleep. It merely lowered its voice when the storms came. From the temple heights, the living machine of the Republic seemed orderly, almost serene, a geometry of light drawn across immeasurable depth. Yet to Mace Windu, standing beneath the eave of a balcony that faced the Senate district, order had never looked more like disguise. He stood without hood or shelter, letting the rain beat against the shaven planes of his head and run darkly down the sleeve of his robe. He had long ago learned that discomfort was sometimes the cleanest way to hear himself think. The storm carried the sound of thunder between towers, but under it and behind it, he felt another pressure, a patient malignance so delicately hidden that it would have been easy to dismiss if it had not remained, night after night, with the insolent steadiness of a man who knew he could not be touched. The Senate spire glowed through the weather like a banked ember. Behind Mace, small steps moved across stone without hurry. He knew the rhythm before he turned. Yoda came out through the archway, with his cloak gathered high at the throat, his ears pressed back slightly against the weather, his eyes narrowed not from rain but from concentration that had not left him for days. "Poorly, the city dreams," Yoda said. Mace inclined his head. "The city never sleeps enough to dream." Yoda came to stand beside him, so near that their sleeves almost brushed. For a time they did not speak again. Below them, Coruscant held out its lights as though it believed itself immortal. The temple bells, deeper within the complex, marked the late hour with a note so low it seemed to rise from the foundations. At length Mace said, "I hoped Maul's death would change the shape of this, not end it. Not that, but change it." "Changed it has," Yoda replied. "Before Naboo, hidden the dark was like a blade under cloth. Now," he lifted one hand slightly, as if weighing a hard-to-name substance in the air. "Now it is smoke in a crowded room. Everyone breathes it, few smell it." Mace looked again toward the Senate. "You found it there." Yoda's silence was answer enough. When he spoke, his voice had lowered further. "In meditation, followed it I did. Past the markets, past the great engines, past the fear of senators, the hunger of merchants, the small deceits of clerks and guards, and all the thousands who lie because the day asks it of them. Deeper, the current grew, narrow, deliberate, around the Senate district. It bent. Mace felt his jaw tighten, not because he resisted the possibility, but because he knew what even naming it aloud would mean. The Jedi were guardians of the Republic. They were not above the law. They did not move against the head of government on instinct and discomfort. The Sith, if a Sith indeed hid in the center of galactic power, would know that better than any historian. "Is it him?" Mace asked. "Or is it around him?" Yoda's expression did not change. "That question, the darkness wants us to ask." Lightning moved silently behind a curtain of rain. Several heartbeats later, the thunder followed, a hard rolling concussion that seemed to make the Senate dome pulse. Mace remembered Naboo as though it had happened yesterday. The funeral flames, the scent of smoke and flowers, Obi-Wan's face white with exhaustion and grief, the body of the Zabrak laid out under guard, too deadly in death to look wholly dead. He remembered as well the absence at the center of every answer. An apprentice had revealed himself. A master had not. Since then, crises had multiplied and always somehow favored the same institutions, the same fears, the same argument. The Republic was too fragile to survive without stronger hands upon it. Qui-Gon had once said, in one of those blunt remarks that seemed almost disrespectful until time proved them precise, that the living force did not care for official stories. The Order had buried him with honor and gone back to evidence, committees, councils, reasonable patience. Mace had defended that patience. He still believed discipline preferable to panic. But patience, like virtue, could be turned into a weapon by an enemy who understood it better than the people who practiced it. "They're gathering," he said. Yoda nodded. The High Council chamber held the storm in its glass. Water streamed down the tall windows in shining veils, distorting the city beyond so that the towers seemed to waver like reflections in dark water. The seats were nearly full. Plo Koon had arrived first, hood still damp. Ki-Adi-Mundi sat with long hands steepled. CZ gaze remained fixed beyond the room, as though he were listening to traffic and weather both. Deepa Bilaba, lean and composed, watched Mace enter with the particular attention of one who knew him too well to miss when his calm was effort rather than condition. Coleman Trebor stood at one side of his chair instead of sitting, a habit of restlessness he had never entirely mastered. Oppo Rantisis coiled upon his seat as if carved there. Koth's expression, always severe, had the added edge of interrupted concentration. No one remarked on the hour. No one asked why they had been called. That, more than anything, told Mace how far the unease had already spread. He took his chair and let the room settle. Yoda was the one who spoke first. "Darkness in the Force grows. Said this before? I have. Tonight, nearer I have felt it than ever before." Nenchai. Ki-Adi-Mundi's brow tightened. "We have all felt the clouding. That alone does not justify action against the Senate." "No one has proposed action against the Senate," Mace said, though it was plain to all that the thought had already crossed too many minds to be denied. "What I propose is inquiry. Quiet, disciplined, immediate inquiry. All records tied to the Naboo crisis are to be reopened. Every surviving trace of Maul's movements, finances, equipment procurement, and transit patterns. Every Senate advisory originating from Palpatine's office in the days before the vote of no confidence. Every security variance in Theed and on Corasont linked to that period." "None. Done." Trebor made a small sound of surprise. "After all these years?" "After all these years," Deepa said before Mace could answer. "The shadow has not lessened." CZ voice came low and measured. "There has been a pressure in official channels as well. Requests delayed, records absent when they should exist. Not enough to indict anyone, enough to notice." Plo Koon folded his gloved hands. "If the Sith survive Naboo by securing influence instead of retreating from it, then our mistake has been expecting concealment to look like isolation. The center of power may be the safest hiding place in the galaxy." Koth shook his head once. "That is too convenient an answer. We are frustrated, so we place the enemy at the place of greatest frustration." "Perhaps," Mace said. "But convenience is not falsehood simply because it arrives where we dislike it." No one answered that. The storm rubbed at the chamber windows with steady hands. Yoda closed his eyes for a brief moment, not in weariness, but in recollection. "At Qui-Gon's funeral spoke we of the rule of two, master and apprentice. The apprentice dead, we thought. The master hidden. Hidden where? Asked this every year. In shadows, in caves, among raiders, among cults. Never once asked we with proper seriousness if hidden meant celebrated. There was an uncomfortable shift among several masters at that, not because any of them lacked imagination, but because the sentence made imagination dangerous." Mace let the silence sharpen. Then he said, "Obi-Wan Kenobi is returning tonight with Skywalker. I want his memory of Naboo re-examined. Not because he failed then, because he was closer to the truth than anyone alive. He saw Maul. He followed the invasion from its first rupture. And Skywalker's relationship with Chancellor Palpatine has become, he chose the gentlest exact word, personal." Deepa's eyes flicked toward him. "You suspect the Chancellor has cultivated the boy. I suspect the Chancellor has cultivated anyone who might one day matter." The chamber doors opened behind them with a restrained mechanical sigh. A protocol droid entered under escort from a temple attendant, its metal shell still beaded with moisture from transit through open corridors. The attendant bowed. "Forgive the interruption, masters. This arrived through the old council relay. Priority read, "The cipher is pre-Reformation temple issue." That brought every face toward the droid. "Origin?" Mace asked. "Uncertain. Layered through dead channels. The source wiped itself after transmission. Contents encrypted beyond our current key set, Master Windu. But several visible phrases remain in the header fragment." "No, yay." The attendant held out a slim data prism. Mace took it. Even cold, it felt wrong in his hand, like a message written with deliberate pressure. "What phrases?" Yoda asked. The attendant swallowed. "Naboo, the office that profited, and one more. It may be a warning or an accusation. We are not sure." "Speak it," said Mace. "The Dark Lord you seek stands where the Republic kneels." Thunder shook the chamber. No one moved. Then Yoda opened his eyes and looked again toward the storm-ridden Senate district beyond the glass. And Mace knew with absolute certainty that whatever had begun on Naboo had finally decided it no longer needed to wait. The transport settled into the temple hangar with a hiss of hydraulic locks and cooling metal. Rain hammered the outer lattice beyond the landing platform, turning the lights of Corasont into streaks of color that seemed to slide down the night itself. Obi-Wan Kenobi remained seated until the vessel had fully settled. He had never loved abrupt endings to motion. There was always a trick in them. The body believed a journey over before the mind had caught up. Across from him, Anakin Skywalker had already unfastened his harness and was leaning toward the hatch with the bright impatience of a man who hated arriving half a breath later than he might have. "You were showing off the descent," Obi-Wan said mildly, rising at last. "I was correcting the drift from the crosswind." "You corrected it flamboyantly." Anakin grinned. At 19, he had grown into his height with the same intensity he gave everything else, as though his own body had not quite had time to keep pace with his appetite for skill. His hair, damp from condensation in the cabin, had fallen forward over his brow. The scar near his eye caught the low hangar light as he turned. The ship handled better for it. It often does, when bullied by someone talented enough. That sounds like praise. It is not. Anakin's grin widened because they both knew it was. They disembarked into the cold, wet air of the hangar. Temple workers were moving more quickly than usual, and not with the efficient anonymity that belonged to routine maintenance. Messages were being carried by hand rather than through the central comm grid. Two knights crossed the far platform in cloaks dark with rain, and did not spare the newcomers more than a glance, though one of them, Anakin noticed, had a hand resting near his saber for no practical reason. He felt the shift in mood before anyone told him of it. The temple, for all its serenity, had currents like any living place. A generation of Padawans could have crossed a single hall in perfect silence, and still he would have known whether they had been laughing minutes before or afraid. Tonight fear moved carefully, wrapped in discipline, but it moved. Obi-Wan noticed it too. The slight set of his shoulders changed. A senior attendant approached them before they had reached the inner corridor. "Master Kenobi, Padawan Skywalker, the Council requests your presence immediately." "No?" Anakin asked. The attendant looked as though he regretted the word even while speaking it. "At once." Obi-Wan's gaze sharpened. "What has happened?" "I am not authorized to say." Anakin glanced at his master. "That usually means something unpleasant, or something political," Obi-Wan replied, "which is usually worse." Under other circumstances, Obi-Wan might have chided him. Tonight he did not. They walked through the temple's upper halls while rain whispered against the outer stone. The lamps had been turned lower in several passageways. Padawans moving under escort made way for them quickly and without the usual flickers of curiosity. Anakin caught the smell of ozone and damp robes everywhere. He also caught, faintly, a familiar current in the force from above. Master Windu's concentration, severe as polished metal, and beneath it Yoda's focus, deeper and stranger, like the pressure one feels under deep water. By the time they reached the antechamber outside the council room, Anakin's own restlessness had sharpened into something almost combative. "They could have let us change first," he muttered, glancing down at the rain darkening the hem of his tunic. Obi-Wan gave him a brief look. If they wanted us comfortable, they wouldn't have summoned us this way. The doors opened. Inside, the storm had turned the windows into trembling bands of silver and black. The council sat waiting. Not languidly, not ceremonially. Waiting the way men waited around a bedside or on a battlefield where the fighting had paused but not ended. Anakin felt every gaze turn toward him, and then, more heavily, toward Obi-Wan. "Master Kenobi," Mace said. "Padawan, Bototi." Obi-Wan bowed. Anakin followed, though not without noticing how Yoda's eyes lingered on him for a heartbeat longer than usual. "You have returned from the mid-rim mediation?" Ki-Adi-Mundi asked. "Yes, Master," Obi-Wan said. "A temporary settlement was reached. It will hold if the Senate remembers the world exists." That earned no smile. Mace rose and came one step down from his chair. "We need you to recount Naboo." Obi-Wan blinked. "Naboo?" "The events there," Yoda said. "All you recall. No detail too small." For a brief instant, something in Obi-Wan's expression became not confusion but resistance born of pain. Naboo had never truly left him. It lived too close to the nerve. He had learned to touch it without flinching only by doing so rarely. "Of course," he said. He began at Tatooine because he had learned long ago that stories lied most often in their beginnings. He spoke of the Queen's urgency, of the attack in the Theed hangar, of Maul's stillness before violence. He spoke of the Zabrak's silence, his discipline, the way he had not fought like a hired killer or an enraged zealot, but like a man carrying instruction that needed no words. He spoke of the invasion's strange precision, the way every part of it seemed designed not merely to coerce Naboo, but to produce a political wound visible to the whole Republic. Mace questioned him with greater precision than Anakin had expected. When Maul pursued the Queen, did he act as though killing her was the point? "No," Obi-Wan said after a pause. "Not exactly. More as though controlling her movement was." "Her movement toward what?" Deepa asked. "The Senate. The vote. Public witness." Yoda watched him without blinking. "And who benefited when Chancellor Valorum fell?" Obi-Wan's voice became careful. "Senator Palpatine." There it was. Anakin felt it in the room before he understood it with his mind. A tightening, subtle but absolute, as though the whole chamber had inhaled and refused to release the breath. Obi-Wan heard it too. "That is not an accusation," he added at once. "It's simply the truth of the outcome." "Truth of outcome matters," Mace said. They questioned him further. The order of messages, the timing of the Queen's return to Naboo, the funeral, Dooku's demeanor afterward, whether Qui-Gon had ever voiced particular suspicions beyond the Sith's return. At Qui-Gon's name, Anakin felt a strange ache move through the room. He remembered the funeral only in fragments. Flames, rain, Obi-Wan standing too still, a kind man from Naboo with tired eyes, and Palpatine's hand resting lightly on his shoulder afterward, as the Chancellor-to-be told him the galaxy had need of brave hearts. When the Council finally turned to him, it was Yoda who asked the first question. "From Naboo onward, close to Chancellor Palpatine you have been?" Anakin lifted his chin. "He's taken an interest in my progress." "Why?" Mace asked. The bluntness of it irritated him at once. "Because he's kind." Mace's face did not change. "That was not the question." Anakin heard himself answer more sharply than he intended. "He says the Republic needs Jedi who understand people, not just rules. He asks about my training. He asks what I think." "And what do you think of him?" Plo Koon asked, gentler than the others. Anakin hesitated only because the answer seemed too obvious. "I think he cares about the Republic. I think he's burdened by people asking him to hold everything together while they argue around him. I think..." He stopped because suddenly, under all those old eyes, the sentence sounded less like judgment than affection. Yoda's gaze softened in a way that made Anakin immediately defensive. "And wise in you, he believes himself to see." "He's never treated me like a problem to be managed," Anakin said. No one spoke for a moment. Obi-Wan did not look at him. That hurt more than if he had. Mace folded his arms inside his sleeves. You are dismissed for now, Skywalker. For now? For now. Anakin knew dismissal when he heard it, and knew exclusion even better. He bowed because refusing would prove too much and turned for the door. At the threshold he stopped, looked back and said, "If this is about the Chancellor, you should tell me openly." "It is about many things," Mace said. Which, of course, meant yes. Outside in the antechamber, the doors sealed him away from the room. He stood there for several heartbeats, fighting the childish impulse to stay and listen through stone. The temple attendant waiting nearby held out a small hand unit. "Padawan Skywalker. A message arrived for you from the executive offices while you were in transit." "May." Anakin took it. Obi-Wan emerged from the chamber before he had finished reading. Water from the edges of his robe had begun to dry. He looked older than he had an hour earlier. "What is it?" he asked. "An invitation," Anakin said. "The Chancellor is hosting a small reception for starfighter cadets and planetary defense officers tomorrow. He wants me there." Obi-Wan held out his hand. After a brief hesitation, Anakin passed him the device. Palpatine's message was warm in exactly the way Palpatine himself was warm. Personal without impropriety, encouraging without overt flattery, written as if the recipient had already become important enough to deserve direct attention. Obi-Wan read it once and handed it back. He should not be doing this. Anakin stared at him. "Inviting me to a reception? Cultivating a private relationship with you. He's the Chancellor. That is exactly why." Anakin laughed once, without humor. "You think everyone who notices me must have an angle." Obi-Wan's expression tightened. "No, dice. I think some people notice others because they want something from them. That's how. And the Order doesn't." The words landed harder than Anakin had intended. He saw it immediately in the stillness that came over Obi-Wan, in the way he seemed to gather his patience around himself before speaking. "The Order wants you to become yourself with discipline," Obi-Wan said. "That is not the same as wanting to own you." "Sometimes it feels the same," Rain whispered in the long corridor beyond them. Obi-Wan looked at him then, fully, and with a weary tenderness Anakin had never known how to answer without anger. "You are being asked to trust people who have known how dangerous this game is for longer than you have been alive. And I'm being asked to distrust a man who's done nothing but encourage me." "Friendliness," Obi-Wan said quietly, "is not innocence." Anakin turned the hand unit over in his palm. The Chancellor's signature glowed faintly on the screen. Somewhere behind the council doors, the conversation continued without him. Somewhere beyond the temple, the executive offices of the Republic burned gold through the storm. And for the first time since he had first met Palpatine on Naboo, Anakin felt not loyalty alone when he thought of him, but the beginning of offense on his behalf. A dangerous emotion because it made suspicion feel like insult and insult feel like duty. When Mace finally emerged, he did not ask Anakin what the message had said. He only told Obi-Wan, "You'll speak to Senator Amidala at first light. She may remember more than she realized at the time." "And Skywalker?" Obi-Wan asked. Mace looked at Anakin for a long moment. "He goes with you." Anakin almost asked whether that meant trust or surveillance. But Mace had already turned away, and the storm outside the temple had grown louder, as though the city itself were drawing nearer to hear. In his private dressing chamber, Palpatine stood before a long mirror of smoked crystal and watched age settle over him by choice. He did not think of the face he wore for the Senate as false. Falsehood implied insufficiency. This face was a tool, no less real than the blade hidden in a cane or the poison folded into courtesy. He let his shoulders bend slightly, let one corner of his mouth soften into habitual sympathy, let the skin around his eyes sink into practiced weariness. In a galaxy that believed power loud and obvious, frailty was one of the purest disguises available. A servant fastened the clasp at his collar. Another laid the outer robe across his shoulders. Palpatine thanked them both with personal warmth, and both left with the faintly dazed gratitude of people who had just been noticed by the sun. When the doors sealed behind them, he straightened at once. On the table beside him lay 3 items he had read before dawn and would read again before noon. A security update from Coruscant's lower Senate works, a coded economic report routed through Sereno, and a note from Sly Moore summarizing the previous day's agitation over the Military Creation Act. The Republic's outer seams were fraying exactly as he required. Systems complained of neglect, corporations cried insecurity, senators begged for moderation while preparing privately for force, and all the while the clone army ripened in secrecy on a world the Jedi no longer knew how to find. It was elegant. It would have pleased his old master had his old master lived long enough to appreciate the superiority of a plan that used affection as often as terror. Yet before leaving his chamber, Palpatine took up the message from Sereno again. No reply from Dooku. That, more than the Senate's daily hypocrisies, irritated him. He set the note down and moved through the private corridors toward the rotunda, where Mace Windu awaited him in formal blue and crimson, vast and composed, and Sly Moore stood like a pale blade wrapped in silk. The docket is full, Mace Windu said. Corellia wants guarantees. Malastare wants concessions. Several mid-rim delegations are requesting a security briefing in private. Of course they are, Palpatine said kindly. Fear always prefers privacy before it asks to be made law. Sly Moore inclined her head. There is another matter. The Jedi Temple requested access overnight to archived records from the Naboo crisis. Palpatine did not pause. Did they? They cited irregularities in historical indexing. And the archivists? Complied, Mace Windu said, the word edged with mild disapproval. He had always preferred institutions that resisted until commanded. Palpatine smiled. Good. Compliance is healthy. Delay would have looked suspicious. Sly Moore's colorless eyes held his. Should the relevant channels in the lower districts be burned? He said. There it was. No one in his inner circle survived long without learning the utility of indirect language. A man could be hanged for many things. He was rarely hanged for understanding the obvious and declining to pronounce it. Not yet, Palpatine said. Watch first. Panic is always informative. Mace Windu lowered his voice. And if they move beyond archives? Then we will learn whether they have become bold or merely confused. He entered the rotunda to applause. It came the way applause always came in the Senate, dutiful first, then warming as the room caught sight of itself approving. The chamber spiraled upward in tier upon tier of floating pods, each lit from within like a window in a tower at night. Rain struck the great translucent shell above and made the chamber feel, for an instant, as though it existed at the bottom of an ocean. He loved that illusion. It made all the struggling voices around him seem very small. He took his central platform, touched the rail with both hands, and bowed his head in acknowledgement of a devotion he had spent years teaching them to feel. They wanted him reluctant. That was the secret. Despots who looked eager frightened even fools. Saviors who looked burdened could be handed anything. The morning's debate, formally, concerned defensive appropriations and regional emergency powers. In truth, it concerned the same thing every day's debate now concerned. Whether the Republic was so unstable that it ought to surrender pieces of itself for the sake of survival. Palpatine let others speak first. He let panic reveal itself in procedural language. He let fear dress in dignity and present itself as prudence. When he finally stood to answer, the chamber quieted almost tenderly. My friends, he said, and meant not friendship but possession. No government can preserve peace by becoming the very thing from which peace requires protection. Yet neither can a government survive if it refuses to recognize danger, because danger makes us uncomfortable. We must be wise enough to be patient and brave enough to prepare. Approval moved across the chamber like wind over grain. He offered no final conclusion. He never did when men were ready to supply one on his behalf. As the debate rolled on, he let part of his mind drift outward. The force around the rotunda was loud with vanity, exhaustion, hope, deceit, hunger, self-pity, loyalty, and the constant tiny abrasions by which intelligent beings wounded each other in the ordinary work of public life. He knew how to hide inside that abundance. It was like slipping a drop of blood into a river and asking who might ever separate it again. Yet, the temple's attention touched the edges of his concealment more distinctly than it had in years. Yoda had brushed against him before, usually in passing, usually as one tests a locked door without admitting even to oneself that one means to open it. But last night there had been more persistence in the touch, and beneath it the hard, unornamented control of Mace Windu. Palpatine did not mistake curiosity for threat. Curiosity often saved an enemy from foolishness. Threat began when curiosity found discipline. He finished the session, accepted private petitions, listened with practiced sympathy to a delegation from the expansion region, reassured a frightened senator from a minor world he would never visit, and then retired to an adjacent chamber with Mace Windu and Sly Moore, while aides swarmed the corridor outside like bees around a wounded flower. "There's one more detail," Sly said. "An invitation to young Skywalker has been delivered." "Good." Mace Windu's heavy features remained unreadable. "You still find the boy useful." "I find everyone useful," Palpatine said. "Skywalker is merely rarer in his use." Mace Windu knew better than to pursue that. Palpatine moved to the window's slit and looked out over the rain-bright towers. The Jedi Temple stood far off but still visible, a pale shape on its high ground. So long as it remained what it had become, wise, ceremonial, cautious, divided between insight and institution, it would be manageable. He had spent more than a decade helping it become exactly that, though the Jedi would never understand how often they had assisted of their own accord. Still no reply from Dooku. That was a pebble in the shoe of the morning. Not enough to halt the stride. Enough to irritate every step. "Have the Senate Maintenance Bureau send confirmation of full archival access to the temple," Palpatine said. "Promptly and with no omissions. Let them feel indulged." Sly Moore inclined her head. "And the lower relay?" He considered for only a moment. "Put it under observation. If anyone touches it, I want to know before it dies." Mace Windu said, "There will be risk. There is always risk. There is rarely clarity. I would prefer both." Nah. When they departed, Palpatine remained alone a while longer and let his pleasant public face loosen, not all the way, only enough for the kindness to leave it. Beneath kindness, his features did not look cruel. Cruelty was a sentiment. He had long since become something cleaner than sentiment. The storm rolled over Corasont with solemn grandeur, and somewhere inside it the Jedi were beginning, at last, to look in the right direction. He should have felt alarm. Instead, he felt a flicker of delight. A game improved when the opposing player finally noticed the board. Sereno wore its weather like an old title, with ceremony and no apology. Rain swept the mountain glass of House Sereno's principal keep in long diagonal strokes, and the ancestral hall beyond the windows glowed in honeyed amber from ranks of standing lamps. The portraits of dead counts watched from paneled walls with that aristocratic severity, which mistakes endurance for virtue. Between them hung old blades, lacquered shields, and the skull of a hunting beast, whose name no one living any longer cared to remember. Count Dooku stood alone beneath those inherited witnesses, and read Sidious' latest instruction by the pale light of a covert holonet, no larger than a palm. The lower relay on Coruscant had entered its dangerous season. Temple activity around Naboo records had increased. Senate fears were to be sharpened, not blunted. Preparations among disaffected systems were to proceed. The Kamino matter remained secure. The Jedi were not to be allowed a clean line between political unrest and military design. There was more, in the tone if not the wording. A master's assumption. An old man's habit of command. The satisfied cruelty of someone who believed all futures worth having must pass through his hand first. Dooku's mouth thinned. He had not become Count of Sereno again in order to exchange one council for another. That thought came too often of late, and with it the tiresome necessity of admitting he had made his bargain with open eyes. Sidious had not lied to him about the Republic's rot. The Senate was corrupt, the Jedi timid, the galaxy drifting toward fragmentation under men who called paralysis virtue because it preserved their dignity. Dooku had seen it before Qui-Gon's death and seen it more clearly after. But clarity regarding disease did not make the physician holy. He closed the message and stood very still. In the hearth at the far end of the hall, coals shifted and whispered into fresh flame. Qui-Gon Jinn came back to him, as he still did on certain nights, not as a ghost and not as a wound, but as a disturbing integrity the years had failed to soften. Of all his former Padawans, Qui-Gon had been the least governable and the most trustworthy, a combination that made institutions uneasy and honest men proud. He had asked questions that sounded naive until they revealed themselves prophetic. He had loved the Force more than the Order, which was precisely why the Order had needed him and never fully known what to do with him. Dooku remembered, absurdly and with painful detail, a morning on Corasont when Qui-Gon had stood in a training gallery at 15, hair damp from exertion, and asked whether peace maintained by fear could still be called peace if everyone learned to smile while obeying. Dooku had answered then with something elegant and incomplete about law, proportion, stability. Qui-Gon had listened respectfully and remained unconvinced. He would have hated Sidious. No, Dooku corrected himself in the privacy of his own severity. Qui-Gon would have understood Sidious at once and hated what understanding required him to do. That difference mattered. He moved to a carved desk older than the Republic's current constitution and opened a hidden compartment set beneath its writing surface. Inside lay a Temple-era cipher rod wrapped in plain cloth. He had kept it not from sentiment but because some bridges were too useful to burn. Now, as he took it up, he admitted the lie of that even to himself. A tool preserved for long enough became a confession. The relay he used existed under 3 graves and an oath, routed through commerce nodes abandoned before many current senators had been born. It took patient hands to wake it and more patient thought to speak through it without signing one's name in blood. Dooku's hands were patient. His thoughts had only become more so with age. He seated himself and began to compose. He did not do so with the ardor of repentance. That would have insulted everyone involved. What moved him now was more complex and less flattering. Pride, certainly. Disgust. Curiosity. A desire to see whether the Jedi could rise above their own caution if given a truth ugly enough to offend them personally. And beneath all that, buried where he did not enjoy finding it, grief. You hunt the blade and ignore the hand. He deleted it. Too theatrical. Naboo is no beginning, only exposure. He kept that. The office that profited from crisis has not ceased to profit. He kept that too. Then, after a long pause in which his face hardened with something like contempt for himself, he added the sentence that would make the message impossible to dismiss as mere political malice. The Dark Lord you seek stands where the Republic kneels. He attached 2 fragments. One was a routing signature from the executive relay architecture beneath the Senate. The other was a partial designation stolen from deeper files than any senator knew existed. Kamino, archive world removed per instruction. That would sting. It would also tempt. The Jedi had always loved mystery most when it insulted order. He layered the message in obsolete temple protocol, bounced it through dead mercantile lanes, and sent it. For a few breaths he sat motionless while the system confirmed dispersion and source wipe. Then he crushed the relay crystal between thumb and forefinger until it cracked. A soft movement at the door. His major domo, old enough to remember when Dooku had first returned to claim the title, bowed from the threshold. "My lord, the envoys from the Outer Rim are waiting." Dooku slipped the broken crystal into the hearth. "Then they have waited long enough." The major domo hesitated. "There is also a message from Corasont, marked private." "Of course there is." He rose and fastened his cloak, becoming again the Count the galaxy believed it understood. Aristocratic, incisive, dangerous in the civilized way that made lesser men mistake manners for harmlessness. At the door he stopped. "If anyone asks," he said without turning, I spent the morning reading provincial tax disputes and regretting the state of civilization. The major domo, who had served too many noble houses to be startled by any form of truth when delivered as absurdity, bowed again. Yes, my lord. Dooku crossed the hall toward duty, and in the polished floor below him, his reflection moved like a man walking on dark water. He had sent no plea for alliance, no map to salvation. He had merely introduced uncertainty into a game already arranged against him, against the Jedi, against the Republic itself. That was all. Yet as he entered the receiving chamber where petitioners waited with polished grievances and controlled hunger in their eyes, he found himself thinking not of Sidious, but of Yoda. Old master, old rival, old conscience he had long ago chosen to wound by leaving. Would Yoda hear him in the message? Would he hear the arrogance first, as he should? Or would he hear, underneath the arrogance, the one thing Dooku despised giving anyone at all? Warning. If Sidious learned the source, consequences would come. Dooku knew that. Perhaps he even desired it. There was a limit to how long a man of his pride could endure living in another's shadow while pretending the shadow was strategic. He took his seat before the envoys. Rain battered the high windows behind him. A lesser noble began speaking of tariffs and border insecurity, and the inability of the Republic to protect legitimate commerce. Dooku listened with courteous attention while, many systems away, his message cut through dead channels toward the temple he had abandoned, and the war he had just, perhaps, hastened into a different shape. Morning on Corasont was less an arrival than a thinning of darkness. The storm had not passed. It had merely lightened enough for the towers outside Senator Padmé Amidala's apartment to emerge from the rain as pale vertical phantoms. Within, the rooms held a different weather. Lamp glow, muted voices, the soft, swift movements of attendants already carrying the weight of the day before breakfast had ended. Formal reports waited on a low table. 2 senatorial aides stood in discreet consultation by the far wall. Captain Typho, broad-shouldered and unsmiling, occupied the space near the entry with the quiet vigilance of a man who had learned long ago that public office attracts private knives. Padmé herself stood by the window with a cup of untouched tea growing cooler in her hand. Her schedule that morning promised everything that had taught her to distrust political usefulness: a committee session on food corridor subsidies, a private consultation with a delegation from Iriadu, and a restricted security briefing that would likely use 30 careful words to conceal one ugly truth. She was reading the beginning of a speech she had no intention of giving when Typho crossed to her and said, "The Jedi are here." For a moment she thought he meant a formal delegation. Then Obi-Wan entered, and beside him came Anakin. The years between memory and present collapsed with indecent speed. Obi-Wan she had expected to one day look exactly like this. Composed, watchful, handsome in the restrained way that seems incidental until one notices the discipline required to wear responsibility so gracefully. But Anakin. For one absurd instant she saw at once the boy from Tatooine, and the man who had replaced him, and because the mind will insist on cruelty when startled, she felt the distance between those images as a private blow. He was taller than she had imagined, broader in the shoulders, his face sharpened out of childhood into something powerful and unfinished. There was still openness in him, but it now lived beside force rather than innocence. He bowed. "Senator. Anakin, Tatai." Her voice came softer than intended. She corrected it with a smile. "It's good to see you." "And you," he said, and the simplicity of it carried too much. Obi-Wan spared them both the danger of that silence. "Forgive the intrusion. We need a private word regarding Naboo." At that, Padmé's gaze shifted fully to him. "Naboo?" Typho was already moving. "I'll clear the room." "No," Padmé said reflexively, then reconsidered. "Yes, everyone but Captain Typho." Obi-Wan inclined his head. "If possible, Captain, I would ask that even you remain outside for part of this conversation." Typho's expression made plain his opinion of such requests. Padmé saved him from voicing it. "Please." When the room had emptied and the doors sealed, The apartment seemed suddenly larger and colder despite the lamps. Rain rattled the glass. Padmé set down her tea. "What about Naboo?" Obi-Wan came directly to it, for which she was grateful. "The Council has reopened the record of the invasion. We are looking specifically at timing, communications, and any irregularities that may not have seemed meaningful then." Padmé watched him carefully. "Irregularities involving whom?" He did not answer at once, which was answer enough. "No," she said before she could stop herself. Obi-Wan's face altered very slightly. "We are not accusing. We are examining." "Examining Senator Palpatine? The man who helped save Naboo?" Anakin shifted, and she knew at once he shared her instinctive resistance, though his reasons were not the same. Obi-Wan remained still. "The man who rose to the chancellorship through a catastrophe orchestrated by the Sith," he said. "The same catastrophe in which Darth Maul revealed himself. The same catastrophe that produced exactly the political fracture the Sith required." "Nay." Padmé felt heat rise into her chest, not because the logic was impossible, but because it was insultingly plausible. "That proves nothing." "No," Obi-Wan said. "It doesn't." "Then why come to me?" "Because you were there," he said. "Because you trusted him. Because if anything was unusual, you may have overlooked it precisely because you had reason not to doubt." The cruelty of the sentence lay in its fairness. Padmé turned away from them and looked back toward the rain. Beneath the city's blurred silver, the traffic rivers moved in calm patterns, indifferent to the possibility that one of the Republic's founding assumptions might be rotten at the center. "During the invasion," she said slowly, "everything was unusual. Nothing felt stable enough to measure against normalcy. Sometimes," Obi-Wan said, "that's when the truest pattern appears." Anakin had remained uncharacteristically silent. Now, he spoke. "The Chancellor has always been good to me." Padmé looked back at him. There was no artifice in the statement. Palpatine had indeed shown him attention from the beginning. She remembered it. The kind old statesman from Naboo, bending to speak kindly to a gifted child standing lost in grief and change. At the time it had seemed generous, almost paternal. Had it been? She hated that the question could now be asked without absurdity. "I know," she said gently. Anakin's jaw flexed. "Then, you know he isn't." "Kindness," Obi-Wan said, almost too quietly to count as interruption. "And strategy are not enemies, Anakin." "That's easy to say when you distrust politics on principle." Obi-Wan absorbed that without visible reaction. Padmé had the sharp impression that these two had been stepping around the same wound for years. She crossed to a low cabinet built into the wall and knelt before it. The hidden latch released under her thumb. Inside were sealed boxes from Naboo, things too personal or too old to keep in active use, but too bound to memory to surrender to storage. She opened one and began sorting through data plaques wrapped in cloth. "When I was queen," she said, not looking up, "Palpatine advised me more by omission than by instruction. He almost never told me what to do directly. He asked questions. He emphasized risks. He let silence do the work of persuasion." She found the plaque she had half remembered and held it still without reading. "At the time I thought that was respect." Obi-Wan knelt opposite her. "And now? Now I think it may have been skill." She activated the plaque. Captain Panika's old security memorandum bloomed in the air between them in faded blue script. Typho, from outside the closed door, could not see it. Anakin leaned in over her shoulder. "It was filed after the recovery of Theed," Padmé said. "Panika thought one of our emergency route ciphers had been compromised during the escape from Naboo. Not the public route, one of the reserve palace channels. Only a handful of people should have known the key, and one of them was Palpatine from his years as senator." Obi-Wan read quickly. The Queen's decoy vector was anticipated. Alternate extraction path likely exposed by advisory channel bearing valid Theed emergency seal. He looked up. "Why was this buried?" Padmé held his gaze. "Because the war ended. Because Palpatine became Chancellor. Because Naboo needed stability more than it needed suspicion. Because I was 14, exhausted, and surrounded by men eager to call every irregularity the residue of battle instead of conspiracy. Her voice hardened on the last word. "Choose any answer you like. They're all true." Anakin read the memorandum with increasing disbelief. "This doesn't say Palpatine did anything. It says the code was used. Anyone could have accessed it." "Naboo." "Yes," Obi-Wan said. "But very few would have known to use it." Padmé rose and moved back toward the window, arms folded across herself. "There was something else," she said. He was never surprised by exactly the right developments. Obi-Wan did not misunderstand her. "Explain." He reacted correctly. Always correctly. When the invasion worsened, he was grave, but not shocked. When I returned to Naboo, he argued against it just enough that my choice would seem wholly my own. When Valorum fell, she stopped and saw it again. The Senate chamber, the heat of humiliation, the terrible theater of politics in full motion. Palpatine's face had been solemn, supportive, ready. He looked like a man stepping into weather he had already dressed for. Rain slid down the glass behind her in sheets. Anakin approached, but did not touch her. "You trusted him. So did half the Republic," she said. "And you still do," he insisted, as if loyalty could be preserved by force of declaration. Padmé turned. "I trust what I have known of him," she said. "That is not the same as trusting everything he may be." The sentence struck him. She saw it. Obi-Wan took the data plaque and secured it inside his robe. "This helps." "It helps you suspect," Anakin said. "It helps us think," Obi-Wan corrected. Anakin looked at both of them in disbelief, sharp enough to be nearly anger. "You're building a monster from timing and manners." Obi-Wan met his gaze. "And what does the Sith build himself from, if not timing and manners?" No answer came quickly enough. Padmé watched Anakin then with a discomfort she could not name cleanly. He was not wrong to resist. Resistance was human. We defend the shape of goodness we have personally received, because admitting that goodness might have been transactional feels like admitting foolishness in ourselves. And Anakin, for all his power, still carried old hungers too close to the surface. To be seen, praised, trusted. Those things reached him deeply. Palpatine had reached him through them. The idea was almost unbearable. She softened her voice. "If you are wrong, then you will have been cautious around a statesman. The Republic can survive that. If you are right, neither of them required the rest." At the door, Typho knocked once, a soldier's signal rather than a servant's. "Senator, 5 minutes until your first committee line." Padmé did not answer immediately. Her eyes were still on Anakin. "Be careful," she said. He gave a short nod, but she could see he did not mean the same care she did. When Obi-Wan and Anakin left, the apartment seemed emptier than before, though aides soon returned and papers resumed their quiet tyranny. Padmé remained by the window long enough for Typho to glance at her twice. "Well?" he asked at last. She looked out toward the storm-veiled city and thought of Naboo, of a funeral pyre, of a kindly man from home whose rise had seemed like justice after disaster. Then she said, with more honesty than comfort, "I am not certain anymore which memories were mine and which ones were arranged for me." The archives held silence differently from the rest of the temple. Elsewhere, silence belonged to discipline, meditation, distance from impulse. In the archives, it belonged to accumulation. It was the hush of things recorded and waiting. Maps, histories, treaties, field journals, species catalogs, dead philosophies, half-forgotten wars, and the patient vanity of civilizations convinced that keeping an account of themselves would somehow rescue them from repetition. Jocasta Nu moved through that silence like a woman who had made terms with its burdens and no longer feared being judged by paper. Her white hair was bound severely back from a face that had never learned the usefulness of pretending ignorance when irritation would be more honest. She held Panaka's memorandum at a distance, not because her eyesight failed, but because some documents deserved the formal discourtesy of scrutiny. "This," she said at last, should not have survived in a private senatorial box. Obi-Wan stood across the low console from her, hands folded behind his back. It nearly didn't. Jocasta gave him a cool glance that managed to place blame on all living beings equally. The preservation habits of statesmen are more erratic than weather. Still, she touched the hovering script, enlarged the cipher notations, and frowned. This seal sequence is genuine. Theed Emergency Protocol, 3rd Reserve Lattice. But it is not merely Theed. It has been routed through a Republic executive relay. Yoda, standing on the console's integrated lift platform, tilted his head. Certain of this, are you? As certain as one can be, while discussing code that should never have existed in the same room. She summoned a secondary display. Blue lines unfolded it into a network map of old Senate communications architecture. Official grids, redundant channels, maintenance spurs, emergency backups, and below them all, nearly forgotten by current bureaucracy, the darker filaments of executive relays built during successive administrations and rarely fully dismantled because no government ever truly abandoned a secret once it had paid to create one. Jocasta touched a node beneath the Senate district. It glowed red. This routing structure was refurbished during Chancellor Valorum's later term and partially reassigned during the transfer to Palpatine's office. The Theed seal in Panaka's memo intersects here, an executive maintenance relay under the old works quarter. Obi-Wan stared at the display. The works? Yes. He felt the word in the same way he would have felt the opening chord of danger in a duel. Recognition before analysis. The works district sprawled beneath a sector of Corasont older than most current records, a landscape of abandoned foundries, repurposed warehouses, illegal machine shops, forgotten corridors, and municipal structures no sane planner would have built together if he had known they would survive. It was precisely the kind of place where government secrets went either to die or to work in peace. Mace entered before Obi-Wan could speak further. Deepa followed him, then Plo Koon. The old council relay message had by then been partially decrypted and hovered on a separate console. Several lines still fractured, but enough intact to raise the temperature of the room without a flame anywhere near it. Naboo was no beginning, only exposure. The office that profited from crisis has not ceased to profit. The Dark Lord you seek stands where the Republic kneels. Below that, stripped almost to data bones, the attached fragment. Kamino, archive world removed per instruction. Obi-Wan read the final line twice. Kamino? Jocasta's expression sharpened into offended certainty. There is no Kamino in the archives. Yoda looked at her sidelong. If removed, it was... where would it be? Jocasta did not appreciate paradox before mid-morning. Nowhere accessible. Yet once there, Obi-Wan said. Possibly, she admitted, the words sounding like a concession wrung from stone. Mace stood with arms folded inside his sleeves. Can we identify the sender? Jocasta gestured toward the fractured encryption set. Former Jedi protocols. Very old. The syntax is disciplined, aristocratic, and irritatingly precise. Deepa's mouth moved faintly, almost a smile. That narrows it. Yoda said nothing, but Obi-Wan saw something pass through his face like weather over a deep lake. Memory, disappointment, not surprise exactly, but the end of wanting to be surprised. Mace shifted focus. The works relay. Can we locate the specific structure? Jocasta expanded the executive lattice further. If the old route still physically exists, it terminates here. A rusted warehouse designation bloomed in the air over the district map, nestled within service corridors once used to move Senate construction materials decades earlier. The file ownership had been obscured behind shell maintenance contracts, then buried under rezoning orders, then quietly reassigned to a civil engineering authority that no longer existed. Plo Koon exhaled softly through his mask. Someone has been gardening this ground for years, and pruning records as they grew, Depa added. Before Mace could respond, a comm alert flickered to life on the far station. Temple security routed it at highest internal clearance. The signal was weak and stuttering, tagged from a mobile source in the Senate lower districts. Obi-Wan crossed to it first and activated the channel. The image that formed was broken by interference, but Quinlan Vosa's voice came through recognizable despite static and breathlessness. Following courier from Executive Annex. A burst of distortion. Not random. Used old route. Mentioned burn order if Jedi move. Sending partial now. The image steadied just enough to show rain, moving lights, and the quick hard angle of Quinlan's face under a hood. He was running. "Quinlan," Obi-Wan said. "Hold position if you can. Reinforcements." "Can't. They know." Another burst. "There's a lower exchange point in the works." Heard one word clear. He looked over his shoulder. "Kamino. Katati." Then the feed dissolved into noise. Every person in the room became still. "Get him back," Mace said. Temple security was already moving. Obi-Wan turned to go, but Mace stopped him with a gesture. "Not yet. If Quinlan is still inside the trail, more Jedi will only light it up." Anakin entered then, having been left outside long enough to know he had been left outside. His gaze moved from face to face, from the map to the broken message to the word Kamino glowing in unresolved blue. "What happened?" he asked. "An operative in the field found a lead," Obi-Wan said. Anakin came closer to the map despite no one inviting him. "And you still think this points to the Chancellor?" "We think it points to the center of his offices," Mace said. "Which is not the same thing." "No," Yoda said softly. "Not yet." Anakin stared at the fractured message. "Who sent this?" No one answered. Jocasta touched the Kamino fragment as though its existence were a personal insult. "I do not like missing worlds." "Nor do I," Obi-Wan said. Anakin's impatience had become something hotter, less boyish. "Then stop speaking in pieces. If there's a hidden relay in the works and someone from the executive offices is using it, we go there." "We will," Mace said. "Not blindly." Anakin's eyes flicked to him. "Everything you've done so far has been blind." The room cooled by a degree. Obi-Wan's instinct was to rebuke him. Before he could, Yoda spoke. "Blind, perhaps. But now, one eye open." He moved closer to the Kamino fragment and placed a small hand upon the console edge. The blue light climbed the folds of his face. For the first time since dawn, Obi-Wan thought he saw fear there. Not fear of battle, not fear for himself, but the grave apprehension of a teacher who realizes too late that an old lesson has been learned first by the enemy. Mace issued orders with clean efficiency. Temple security would retrieve Quinlan if he surfaced. Jocasta would continue tracing the executive relay architecture and search for signs of archival deletion around the word Kamino. Obi-Wan would remain available for immediate field deployment. Anakin, despite the set of his jaw, would remain attached to Obi-Wan and nowhere else. When the room had thinned again, Yoda remained at the console while the word Kamino pulsed dimly in the air. "Master," Obi-Wan said quietly, "do you think the message is true?" Yoda did not answer at once. "At the center of great noise," he said at last. "Silence hides best. Hear it, we begin to. Prove it, we must." Then the security channel chimed again, this time from the temple's lower landing platform. Tagged emergency medical. Quinlan had come home. Quinlan Vos hated official corridors. They made everyone smell the same. The Senate Annex had reeked of polished stone, scented climate control, expensive cloth, and the studied exhaustion of people whose jobs required them to care publicly about things they had long ago stopped feeling private. That smell vanished the moment he slipped into the service arteries below it. Down there, Corasont became honest again. Ozone, damp rust, fuel vapor, burned insulation, old food, hot wiring, rain leaking through cracked seams where rain was never meant to reach. He kept the pale courier in sight by not staring at him. The man was nothing special to look at. Human, narrow-faced, draped in common executive gray with a hood pulled too low for dignity, but not low enough for concealment. What made Quinlan keep following was not appearance. It was the courier's pattern. He moved like someone trying to seem ordinary while obeying a memorized route. People traveling to mistresses, gambling dens, political bribes, or private humiliations moved with a different kind of furtiveness, more improvisational and more vain. This man moved as though instructions had already been paid for in blood. Rain followed them in threads through the great works and half-open service ducts. The courier passed from bright maintenance passages into market underways crowded by early traders setting up under tarps and shield lamps. Voices in a dozen languages rose and fell around them. Steam exhaled from floor vents. Quinlan let a pair of porters carrying caged poultry cross between him and the target, then cut right through an alley of stacked machine casings where oil dripped in black rhythm from some overhead line older than memory. At a corroded turnstile, the courier paused, touched a blank pass plate, and was admitted by a lock that should not have still had power. Quinlan waited 4 breaths, then crossed to the plate himself. He did not touch it. Instead, he placed 2 fingers against the jamb beside it. Psychometry was rarely graceful. The holodramas of the Corps liked to imagine it as revelation without cost, a gift by which a Jedi touched the world and the world, grateful, told its story. The truth was rougher. Objects kept impressions the way flesh kept bruises, and what they yielded came with all the confusion of the moment that made them. Quinlan had learned not to demand clarity from pain. The metal beneath his fingertips bloomed at once into fragments. A white hand, long-fingered and ringless. Masameda's deep voice, muffled through a wall. No direct names. Another voice, lower, anxious. The old man wants the node watched, not burned, unless temple personnel make contact. A flash of crimson data light. Dewoy. A seal impression from an executive credential. Then fear, sudden, sharp, not from the man currently passing through the lock, but from someone who had touched this plate hours earlier while understanding that if he failed, nothing of him would remain to be identified. Quinlan opened his eyes. Interesting. He bypassed the turnstile with a wrist tool and slipped after the courier into a lower channel that smelled of wet metal and furnace dust. The corridor narrowed, bent twice, then opened into a skeletal service arcade running alongside old industrial shafts. Below it, hidden in steam, vast machines slept under municipal neglect. Ahead, the courier descended a ladder into darkness, lit by a pulse of intermittent amber. Quinlan followed. The chamber at the bottom had once been a relay control room. Its old purpose showed in the architecture. Cable trenches, sealed junction housings, a cracked wall display large enough to project district-scale schematics. Now the room had been repurposed into something leaner and more dangerous. Fresh power cells sat where municipal consoles once stood. Portable holoprojectors ran in muted arrays. Crates lined one wall beneath tarps marked with fake water authority seals. 2 armed guards waited in the room, one Duros in scarred leathers, one broad Weequay with a shock carbine. A pair of spider-like security droids clung to the ceiling like insects too patient to swat. The courier handed over a data cylinder. "We have movement from the temple," he said. The Duros inserted the cylinder into a reader. "Expected." They reopened Naboo indexing. "Executive office says no names, no panic, no burn until contact." "None." The Weequay grunted. "And if contact comes, then the node dies." The Duros read further, then looked up. "What about Kamino?" At that word, Quinlan felt every sense in him sharpen. The courier answered too quickly. "Secure. The file stays erased. The template is already compensated and the cloners are disciplined." The Duros gave a humorless laugh. "Disciplined until someone pays more. Not these." Quinlan shifted fractionally in the doorway shadow for a better view of the terminal. That saved his life. One of the ceiling droids rotated with impossible smoothness, optics flaring red toward the place he had been standing a heartbeat earlier. He moved before the alarm tone finished sounding. The first shot scorched the wall. Quinlan came through the doorway low and fast, lightsaber already in his hand. Blue light exploded against the room's dirty amber. He took the nearest ceiling droid in half before its second weapon arm deployed, kicked the split shell into the Duros, and turned the Weequay's first carbine burst into the floor with 3 quick parries that sent molten sparks leaping around everyone's boots. The courier bolted for the rear hatch. Quinlan would have preferred him. He took the Weequay instead because the Weequay was between him and survival. The man swung the carbine like a club when the saber came too close. Quinlan ducked, drove an elbow into ribs, and felt bone shift. The Duros recovered, drew a slim vibra-blade, and came in from the left while the second droid dropped from the ceiling. 1 against 4. Corasont odds. Quinlan laughed once despite himself and threw a crate with the Force. It hit the droid, shattered seals, spilled coiled cable and illegal power cells across the floor. The Duros came through the debris anyway, quicker than scar tissue should have allowed. Quinlan caught the blade on his saber, felt cortosis flex spit from the edge, twisted. Then the courier, who had not fled after all, fired a dart launcher from the hatch. Pain punched into Quinlan's shoulder. Cold spread instantly down his arm. Sedative, he thought, and followed the thought with contempt. He ripped the dart free, flung it back into the courier's chest, and seized the data cylinder from the terminal in the same motion. The Weequay crashed into him from behind. They went down together among spilled cables and burning sparks. Quinlan's saber flew from his grip and hissed into a puddle, filling the chamber with steam. The Weequay reached for a knife. Quinlan head-butted him hard enough to spray blood, then touched one hand to the man's throat. Another burst of images slammed through him. Palpatine's office window from a servant's height. Masa Meta's silhouette. The phrase executive clearance, spoken with terror and devotion, mingled until they were indistinguishable. A chart of stars, most missing. A helmeted man standing on white stone under impossible rain, while a voice off-screen said, "The template will suffice." Quinlan came up gasping from the contact just as the Duros lunged again. He called his saber to hand, drove the attacker back, and slashed the rear hatch controls. The mechanism detonated in a shower of sparks, buying him 2 breaths and 1 narrow exit. He took both. The climb back through the service ladder cost him feeling in half his left arm. By the time he reached the upper arcade, the sedative had begun to make the lights smear. He ran anyway. Behind him, alarms shifted tone. Somewhere deeper in the relay chamber, a purge sequence had begun. If the node burned, then whatever was on the cylinder in his belt was all that remained. He vaulted a barrier into the market underways, landed badly, nearly blacked out, and kept moving. Ordinary morning life had already resumed around the lower district, as if violence belonged only to those who could afford to notice it. Traders shouted over produce. Mechanic teams rolled welding carts. A child laughed somewhere. Quinlan shoved through the tide, every face around him briefly strange, with the knowledge that none of them understood how close the center of the Republic had just come to speaking too clearly. By the time he reached the temple platform, he was bleeding from shoulder, mouth, and one temple. 2 guards rushed him. He waved them off, found Mace already striding across the landing court, and forced the data cylinder into his hand before his knees decided all arguments were over. From the node, Quinlan managed. Executive route, Kamino, they said. Breath failed him. He swallowed iron and rain. They said the old man wants it watched. Mace caught his arm before he hit stone. Who is the old man? Quinlan tried to answer and instead saw again from that jolt of psychometry the outline of a narrow office and a red glowing skyline beyond it. I felt. He closed his eyes. The center. Then the platform rose toward him, or he fell toward it, and temple healers were suddenly everywhere. And the last thing he understood before darkness took him was that Mace Windu, who rarely allowed emotion to alter the architecture of his face, looked not shocked but confirmed. Yoda's meditation chamber was small enough to insult grandeur. That was why he favored it when thought required honesty. The room held a low platform, a narrow lamp niche, and a vented slit through which the sound of weather could enter without the weather itself. Rain whispered there now with such steadiness that it became almost like breathing. No ornamental banners softened the walls. No ceremonial carvings announced wisdom. The chamber had outlived several architects by refusing to care what any of them thought a master's chamber ought to resemble. Yoda sat cross-legged upon the platform and placed his hands palm up upon his knees. Outside, the temple moved through crisis with that particular efficiency by which disciplined institutions conceal panic from themselves. He could feel the flares of purposeful motion across its levels. Healers around Quinlan, archivists hunting traces of Kamino, Mace turning over the recovered cylinder with the relentless patience that made him formidable, Obi-Wan waiting in strained stillness, Anakin moving like a bright blade inside its sheath, not yet drawn but pressing hard against restraint. And beneath all that, the other current remained. Not broad darkness. Broad darkness was easy. War would bring broad darkness soon enough if unchallenged. This was finer, colder, threaded through living systems with artistry. It touched law, trade, ceremony, loyalty, ambition, affection, art. It borrowed the warmth of other beings until one could mistake it for human complexity rather than deliberate corruption. Yoda let himself sink. The first descent into deep meditation always required surrendering the vanity that one knew where one was going. The mind loved maps because maps excused surprise. The Force rarely cared for maps. It moved like weather over mountains and through the roots of things, indifferent to any path not grounded in truth. Qui-Gon had understood that. The thought did not come as an apparition. It came as memory, which was often holier. Qui-Gon in a temple garden years ago, younger than he died and impatient with abstractions, saying with respectful bluntness, the living Force is not a council chamber master. It does not wait its turn to be heard. Yoda had not forgotten the lesson. He had merely, in the work of surviving decades, learned too many other lessons on top of it. Now he stripped them away. The city opened beneath him. Not physically. Physically, he remained in the chamber while rain combed the storm. But in the Force, Corasont became what all great cities become when viewed without the mercy of distance. Billions upon billions of lives flashing, dimming, converging, recoiling, desiring. Hunger in lower warrens. Lust in Senate apartments. Fear in prison transports. Resolve in hospital wards. Tenderness in homes too small for privacy. Lies in boardrooms. Honest fatigue in transit workers. A child somewhere counting the seconds between lightning and thunder with perfect delight. A woman deciding whether to betray a friend for promotion. A pilot dying in a crash fire 3 kilometers below level and thinking absurdly of the smell of her father's workshop. So much life. So much noise. He let it wash through him. Then he sought not darkness but arrangement. Fear everywhere. Yes. Ambition everywhere. Yes. Vanity, resentment, greed, devotion. Yes, yes, yes. But there the current bent unnaturally. Not because the emotions were stronger, but because they had been taught to flow toward one absence. Like river water around a hidden stone, the lives of the city curled around a will that withdrew itself even while exerting pressure. That was the wrongness. Not abundance of dark, but precision of concealment. He followed it. The Senate district rose in vision before him not as architecture but as relation. The rotunda a whirl of public appetite, the ministries a lattice of anxious obedience, the executive offices a chamber of curated burden. He moved through the rooms not by doors, but by pattern and reached a threshold beyond which the Force thinned abruptly into chill. There are presences in the galaxy that announce themselves with force. This one announced itself by theft. Warmth taken from its surroundings, meaning bent inward. A wound made articulate. He saw a face. No, not the true face. The chosen one. The public one. Kindly eyes. Soft mouth. The patient gravity of a servant of the state. Palpatine awe. The image shifted, and for one beat of the Force beneath it he saw something else. Hood. Depthless gaze. Old malice disciplined into elegance, and around it the roaring approval of worlds too eager for reassurance to ask who supplied it. The vision widened. Anakin blazed at the edge of it. Not fallen, not saved, but reachable. A hand in velvet extending toward him through years of praise. Dooku stood far off like a broken spear pointed both inward and away. Naboo burned. A white world under endless rain. Rows upon rows of armored bodies sleeping in design before waking into command. The Jedi Temple itself, tall and luminous, reflected in a dark pane of glass from which another man watched. Yoda opened his eyes. The chamber had not changed, yet the air in it felt thinner. For several breaths he remained still, letting the vision settle into language without losing the truth by forcing it too quickly into names. That was always the danger. See too much, name too fast, and wisdom collapses into confidence. Yet this was no longer uncertainty, no longer merely a cloud around the Senate. The center had shape. Mace was waiting outside the chamber when Yoda emerged, as if he had known not when the meditation would end, but when its answer would become impossible to delay. Rain sound moved between them through the slit vent. "Well?" Mace asked. Yoda studied him. There were moments when friendship consisted not in comfort, but in deciding a burden should not be carried alone for even one breath longer than necessary. "Not around the Chancellor does the darkness gather," Yoda said. "Through him, it moves." Mace's face stilled. No surprise. No denial. Only the hard acceptance of a man who had spent his life training himself to obey reality once it spoke clearly enough. "How certain?" Yoda's ears lowered slightly. "As certain as I am that rain falls because clouds open, and not because stone below desires to be wet." Mace exhaled through his nose. The sound was nearly a laugh, though no amusement lived in it. "Then we need proof that can stand inside law. Proof for courts, yes. For ourselves, enough already there is. Enough to suspect. Not yet enough to move against a chancellor without shattering the Republic in the attempt." Nah. Yoda did not dispute it. That was the cruelty of the thing. The Sith had chosen their ground well. Slay a raider in a cave, and the galaxy nods. Accuse the elected head of the Republic, and the galaxy demands to know whether the Jedi have finally decided Robe's excuse treason. Mace looked toward the temple's lower levels. "Quinlan's cylinder may give us more. If it doesn't, the works relay itself will. Obi-Wan and Anakin. It was not a question." Mace nodded. "Obi-Wan for judgment. Anakin because if Palpatine has entangled him, I would rather the boy see truth with his own eyes than hear it from us after the fact." Now, Yoda's expression tightened by a degree. Dangerous, that is. So is leaving him outside the door. They walked together toward the central corridor. The temple around them seemed suddenly built for another age, a cleaner age in which enemies had not learned how to wear legitimacy with such grace. Younglings passed in ordered lines 2 halls away, heading to afternoon study, unaware that their elders had finally laid a name upon the shape haunting every meditation. Palpatine. The simplicity of it offended Yoda more than the wickedness itself. Evil rarely looked monstrous while it was winning. It looked useful, tired, necessary. A hand on the shoulder at a funeral. A voice asking for patience. A public servant whose kindness arrived exactly where need was deepest. At the junction to the council lift, Mace paused. "When we go to him," he said, "and we will, do you think he'll know?" Yoda looked out through an archway where stormlight painted the stone floor silver. "Already," he said. "Perhaps he does." By late afternoon, the storm had become part of the city's machinery. Rain fell through higher traffic lanes, shattered on shields and awnings, and descended in finer, dirtier forms to the lower districts. In the works it came laced with metallic taste from old stacks and rust from places where the weather had been winning quietly for decades. Obi-Wan and Anakin moved through it in civilian cloaks over combat gear, their hoods low, their sabers hidden but not inaccessible. Temple intelligence had provided Quinlan's extracted route data, the fractured node coordinates from Jocasta, and one useful truth every investigation eventually acquires. Somewhere ahead waited men who would kill rather than answer questions. Anakin walked half a pace ahead because he always did when troubled. The descent platforms took them from the Senate heights down through maintenance bands and service canyons, where the Republic's polished self-image thinned into pipes, girders, freight rails, and neighborhoods the Senate remembered only when drafting speeches about labor. Hollow signs buzzed in rain haze. Foundry towers loomed like extinguished castles. Welding arcs flashed in distant alcoves and vanished. This was still Corasont, center of civilization. But it was civilization with its makeup washed off. Obi-Wan let Anakin keep the lead long enough to prove he was not trying to command by reflex. Then he said, "You're angry. Insightful. You're letting it make you careless." Anakin's mouth tightened. "We're walking into a trap under the Chancellor's city, because a dead cipher, a wounded operative, and a meditation all say he might be a Sith. I think anger is a proportionate response." "No." Obi-Wan absorbed the bitterness. "Might?" Anakin turned sharply. "You saw Padmé's memo. You saw the executive routing. Fine. Someone near him is compromised. That doesn't make him Sidious." "No, it doesn't." "Then stop looking at me as if I'm stupid for not leaping to the worst conclusion." Obi-Wan stopped in the shelter of an overhead strut, while a freight crawler roared past on an adjacent line. Rainwater fell from the machinery in black rivulets around them. "I am not looking at you that way," he said. "I am looking at you as someone the Chancellor has singled out for years. That matters. To you, or to the Council?" "To me." The answer struck harder than argument. Anakin looked away first. Below them, an old furnace mouth glowed dimly behind iron grating like a beast breathing in sleep. Obi-Wan continued, quieter now. "I know what it is to be loyal to a man who changed your life. I know what it is to hear people speak of him as if they see more clearly than you do." Anakin thought of Qui-Gon before he could stop himself. Obi-Wan saw that he had thought it. Their shared silence filled with the dead. "We are not here to confirm anyone's fear," Obi-Wan said. "We are here to find truth. If it clears Palpatine, I will be grateful. If it condemns him, we will need to face that too." Anakin gave a short nod that was not agreement but enough of it to continue walking. The route led them through a shuttered repair market, down a conveyor trench no longer used for ore, but still warm from the pipes below it, and into a narrow municipal corridor marked by hazard sigils half-eaten by rust. Quinlan's map fragment flickered from Obi-Wan's wrist unit. "Here," he said. A maintenance hatch sat flush in the wall behind a stack of obsolete conduit housings. No lock was visible. Anakin ran fingers across the seam and frowned. Pressure-coated. Obi-Wan handed him the fragment of executive credential extracted from Quinlan's cylinder. "Try this." Anakin touched the shard against the invisible plate. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the wall withdrew with the quiet precision of expensive engineering masquerading as decay. The chamber beyond had the same stripped purpose Quinlan had described, but more of it now lay dead. Someone had triggered a partial purge after the fight. One bank of consoles was melted black. Cable runs had fused into grotesque knots. The air smelled of burned insulation and chemical suppressant. Yet not everything had died. A secondary terminal still pulsed faintly on auxiliary power, and on the far wall a district hologrid wavered in incomplete layers, showing Senate infrastructure overlaid with hidden routes bright as veins. Anakin stepped inside first and swept the corners. Clear for the moment. Obi-Wan went to the terminal. The remaining files were shielded behind fragmentary encryption, but the executive credential opened more than it ought to have. Data cascaded up in broken clusters. Maintenance schedules, transfer authorizations, shell contracts, routed communications tagged with innocuous bureaucratic labels. He began copying everything to a secure temple drive. Then he saw Naboo. The file was archived under sanitation retrofit of all things. When he opened it, the screen produced a chain of executive relay messages from the days of the invasion. Each bounced through intermediaries, but bearing the same routing architecture embedded in Panaka's memorandum. Several had been scrubbed. 2 remained partial. One referred to intercepting the royal vessel if it reaches Corasont. Another, the vote must proceed regardless of tactical failure on the surface. Anakin came to stand beside him. For once, he had no immediate defense. Obi-Wan opened the next cluster. Kamino on contract status. Active. Archive world removal verified. Template compensation complete. A short associated visual flickered before corruption tore it. A broad man in armored gear seen from behind, standing beneath hard white rain. "What is that?" Anakin asked. Obi-Wan's voice went thin. Proof that whoever built this node had access to the Jedi archives, and to something military. He copied faster. Another file opened by accident or grace. Financial transfers to obscure intermediaries. Procurement of growth acceleration equipment. Cloning metrics. Senate emergency projections cross-referenced against regional unrest reports fed by agents tied to the separatist agitation. The scale of it was dizzying. This was not merely blackmail or bribery. It was architecture. Planning on the level of history. Anakin whispered, "This can't all be his." Obi-Wan did not answer because something behind them had changed in the room's sound. He turned just as a heavy blast door slammed down over the chamber entrance. The first blaster bolt came from the upper catwalk. They moved without thinking. Obi-Wan pulled Anakin down behind a scorched console as red energy chewed through the terminal housing where they had stood. 3 figures advanced from concealed side passages. The scarred Duros Quinlan had fought and survived, now with one arm in a support brace. A heavy-set Weequay whose broken nose had been reset badly, and a human woman in matte armor carrying paired pistols and the expression of someone who considered murder administrative work. "Temple should stayed in its tower," the woman said. Anakin ignited his saber. Blue filled the chamber. Obi-Wan ignited his a heartbeat later. "Temple dislikes being told where to stay." The Duros spat. "Then die where you stand." The firefight was brutal and close. The chamber gave little room for flourish. Pistols barked from high angles. Shock charges rolled under consoles. The Weequay drove forward with a vibro-axe that forced Anakin into hard parries rather than elegant ones. Obi-Wan used the broken architecture, deflecting bolts into hanging cable bundles, collapsing one damaged gantry, sending sparks and molten fragments hissing into puddles across the floor. The armored woman moved like trained security, not a street killer. She never fired twice from the same position. Twice she nearly had Obi-Wan. Twice Anakin covered him before he could acknowledge it. Then the Duros shouted over the noise, "You don't even know who's remaking the galaxy, Jedi." Anakin drove the Weequay back. "If it's you, I'm not impressed." The Duros laughed and triggered a control on his wrist. All remaining consoles in the chamber began flashing purge warnings. Obi-Wan saw at once what was happening. "Anakin, the data drive!" Anakin force-pulled it from the terminal just as a suppression charge blew the station apart. Heat punched across the room. The blast wave threw everyone sideways. Obi-Wan hit the floor, rolled, came up on one knee and sent the armored woman's neck shot back through her shoulder plate. She cried out and fell. The Weequay charged Anakin again. Anakin met him with a strike so hard it sheared the vibro-axe in half and sent the man crashing into the wall. The Duros, limping but still armed, aimed not at either Jedi but at the drive in Anakin's hand. Obi-Wan shouted a warning. Too late. The shot clipped the drive, scoring its casing. Anakin turned with a fury that went beyond combat and into something personal. He crossed the distance between them so quickly the Duros barely managed a second raise of his weapon before Anakin had him by the throat with the Force and pinned against a bulkhead. "Who gave the orders?" Anakin demanded. The Duros' boots kicked against metal. His face darkened. "You don't know," he rasped. "The old man knows exactly what you are." Obi-Wan rose, breath hard. "Anakin, don't. The Chancellor sees you," the Duros wheezed. "Sees what you could be, more than they ever." "Anakin, duck-to-tea." The chamber's failing lights strobed over his face. For one appalling instant, Obi-Wan saw how little distance there might be between righteous anger and delighted cruelty if the right hand ever learned how to guide it. Then Anakin released the Duros as if burned. The man collapsed, gasping. Obi-Wan stepped in, disarmed him, and struck him unconscious with the hilt. "Take the drive," he said. Anakin stared at his own hand once, only once, before obeying. The purge alarms climbed to a shriek. Secondary charges armed somewhere behind the walls. "We're done here," Obi-Wan said. They cut through the blast door using both sabers at once and escaped into the service corridor seconds before the chamber behind them erupted in a chain of concussions that shook rust from the ceiling and sent a plume of black smoke racing after them. They ran through the underways while emergency shutters dropped in neighboring sections. Rain met them again 2 levels up, clean by comparison to the air below. They did not slow until they reached a disused loading bridge overlooking a canyon of pipes and distant traffic. Anakin handed over the scorched data drive. "Will it still work?" Obi-Wan turned it in the gray light. One edge had melted. "Enough of it will." Anakin looked back toward the smoke rising from the underdistrict. He said, "The old man knows exactly what I am." Obi-Wan tucked the drive inside his robe. He said, "What would make you angry? What if it was true?" Rain struck the bridge rail between them in bright, hard drops. Obi-Wan considered all the answers available and chose the only one that did not insult either of them. "Then it matters very much who tells you." Anakin did not reply. Far above, invisible beyond levels and storm, the Senate held its evening lights. Somewhere inside those lights sat a man the galaxy trusted to manage fear. And in Obi-Wan's chest the old grief from Naboo moved again. Not as memory this time, but as anger late enough to feel almost like shame. They turned for the temple with the wounded evidence of a hidden war burning between them and the city. By twilight the temple had the data. Not all of it. Enough. Jocasta and 3 archivists worked with surgical indignation to recover the scorched drive's surviving layers. The results came in shards, but shards cut. Executive relay signatures matched the Naboo era, routing found in Panaka's memorandum. Financial transfers tied the hidden node to shell entities traced through Senate Procurement Office blind accounts. The Kamino fragment persisted across multiple file redundancies, always in the same relation to erased archival authority. There were references to a template, to military maturation schedules, to removal of a world from Jedi records, and to operational guidance designed to exploit crises before, during, and after the Naboo invasion. No single file bore Palpatine's personal name in the incriminating style of fools. No competent conspiracy would have allowed such generosity. But the architecture of the thing radiated outward from executive privilege, and when that architecture was placed beside Dooku's anonymous warning, beside Quinlan's report, beside Yoda's vision, beside the years of inexplicable political advantage flowing through one patient pair of hands, the sum became difficult to deny without lying first to oneself. The council chamber at dusk felt unlike any meeting Obi-Wan had attended in it before. It had had less to do with tension than with scale. Every sentence now seemed to lean against history. Anakin stood at the chamber's edge rather than taking a place nearer the center. He had not spoken during Jocasta's recovery analysis. He had barely spoken at all since the works. Obi-Wan recognized the silence. It was how Anakin behaved when feeling too much to choose a single emotion safely. Loyalty and shock fought in him. So did humiliation. To learn that one's trust may have been chosen for exploitation is to feel both wounded and implicated. Mace laid the recovered data strips on the central console. This is enough to confront the Chancellor. It is enough to detain members of his staff. It may even be enough to justify a restricted investigation under emergency authority if we move before he moves. No. Ki-Adi-Mundi's voice remained measured, but the effort behind it showed. And if we are wrong? If the executive architecture has been compromised by someone inside his offices rather than by the Chancellor himself? Then we uncover that, Deepa said. But if we are right and hesitate because the shape of truth offends us, then we have spent years guarding a door while inviting the intruder to dine. Anakin looked up. You're speaking as if it's settled. Mace turned to him. It is settled that the Chancellor is at the center of a hidden network touching the Sith, Naboo, and an illegal military project on a deleted world. That is not the same as saying he is the Sith Lord. Yoda's gaze rested on the young man with deep sadness, and no condescension. When one room is cold, ask if window open it is. When every room in the house is cold and one fire burns untouched, ask who sits by the fire. Anakin's expression tightened. That's not proof. No, Mace said. It isn't. It's pattern. Proof is what we will demand from him in person. The chamber darkened slightly as the storm outside thickened again. Lamps along the inner wall brightened in response. Obi-Wan heard his own voice before deciding to use it. He won't answer directly. No, Mace said. But answers are not the only things men give when cornered. Anakin took one step forward. Then I'm coming. Not to this meeting, Mace said. The refusal landed like a strike. You think I'll warn him? I think, Mace replied, that you are too personally entangled to be trusted with the first move. The words were true, and because they were true, they were crueler than insult. Anakin flushed. Obi-Wan felt him go hard inside, not outwardly. Outwardly, he only became more still, but in the Force he tightened like a cable under strain. Master Windu, Obi-Wan began. Mace cut him off with the smallest motion. This is not punishment. It is precaution. To protect the Republic, Anakin said. And this time the bitterness was too clear to mistake. To protect all of us, Yoda said. For a moment it seemed Anakin might argue further. Instead he bowed, too sharply, and stepped back into shadow. The gesture hurt Obi-Wan more than protest would have. When the council broke, Mace selected the delegation with minimal theater. Himself, Yoda, and Obi-Wan. Not a strike team. Not yet. Temple security would quietly prepare contingencies. Senate guards loyal to procedure rather than personality would be watched for irregular movement. Healers would remain on alert. No message would precede them. Surprise, if any remained possible, belonged to those willing to walk into danger politely. The journey from the temple to the Chancellor's executive suite took less than an hour and felt longer than Naboo had. Rain washed the transport canopy as they crossed the city. Corasont at night no longer looked like civilization to Obi-Wan. It looked like circuitry, light passing through systems built by too many hands for anyone conscious to oversee. Somewhere under that vastness slept the hidden world named Kamino. Somewhere upon it, if the files told truth, an army was being grown in secret while the Senate debated procedure, and the Jedi mistook fog for weather rather than camouflage. The executive corridors received them with full ceremonial dignity. That, perhaps, was the worst part. The guards at the Chancellor's level bowed. Aides moved aside. Lamps burned steady in polished wall niches. No one ran. No one reached for alarm. The Republic knew how to host its own undoing with exquisite manners. Palpatine's chief attendant admitted them at once. The office beyond was warm in amber and red, the great windows behind the Chancellor's desk turning the storm outside into molten light. Dark wood panels caught the lamp glow richly. Sculpted columns framed the room like a temple dedicated not to any god but to authority itself. On a side table waited a tray with tea service untouched, as though hospitality had anticipated them and chosen not to make a scene of it. Palpatine rose as they entered. "Masters," he said, smiling with grave welcome. "This is an honor. A late one, which usually means either very good news or very unpleasant necessity. I confess I do not know which to hope for." He looked older in the red light. Frailer too. The performance would have been masterful if Obi-Wan had not spent the day learning how many lives had already been arranged beneath it. Mace bowed minimally. "Chancellor." Yoda inclined his head. Obi-Wan did the same. Palpatine gestured toward the seats. "Please, sit." "No," Mace said. For the first time a tiny seam appeared in the performance. Not fear, not even irritation, only recalculation. Palpatine let it vanish at once and folded his hands before him. "As you wish. Then tell me what presses so urgently upon the order." Mace produced one data strip and placed it on the desk between them. "We have been reviewing old records from the Naboo invasion." "How diligent of you." We discovered executive relay signatures connected to compromised Theed ciphers, hidden lower district communications, and covert contracts tied to a world removed from the Jedi archives. Palpatine's eyes moved briefly to the strip and back to Mace. That sounds grave. It is. Yoda watched not the man's face, but the space around him in the Force, and what he felt there nearly stopped his breath. The office was not empty. It was devoured. Warmth entered and changed. Meaning approached and bent. The public charm before them was real in the sense that a mask is real when held in one's hand. But beneath it yawned the same cold absence he had touched in meditation, now nearer than ever, now wrapped in flesh and office and civil speech. Palpatine turned slightly toward Obi-Wan. Master Kenobi, you look troubled. Does this have something to do with Senator Amidala? I know she has been under strain. No. The move was deft. Invoke Padmé, humanize concern, divide the room by invoking their separate loyalties. Obi-Wan answered carefully. This has to do with Naboo, Chancellor, and with the possibility that someone in your executive apparatus has been directing events for many years beyond the knowledge of the Senate. How extraordinary. Palpatine's tone was gentle, almost saddened. If that is true, then I trust the Jedi will help me uncover it swiftly. Mace did not blink. We also recovered references to Kamino. Something changed. Not on Palpatine's face. Not enough for an ordinary observer. But in the Force, the name struck the hidden thing like metal on bone. I'm not familiar with it, Palpatine said. Jocasta Nu would have called the lie artistically disappointing. Yoda took one step forward. Familiar with many things you are, he said. Kindness, burden, patience, long work in shadows. Palpatine looked at him fully then, and in that single exchange, the room lost whatever pretense of ordinary politics had managed to survive the day. There are moments when recognition occurs beneath language, and language then spends the next minute trying to catch up. Obi-Wan saw it happen in both men at once. Yoda, no longer peering into fog but into source. Palpatine, no longer indulging inquiry but meeting certainty. The Chancellor's smile remained. It simply no longer belonged to an old public servant. And where, Palpatine asked softly, does the Jedi Order imagine this line of inquiry leads? Mace's hand lowered, not to draw but to rest nearer the hilt beneath his robe. That depends on your next answer. The storm outside rolled across the sky in red-gold reflection. Rain crawled down the window glass like molten wire. Palpatine's gaze drifted once, almost lazily, toward the empty place in the room where Anakin was not. Interesting, he murmured. You brought Kenobi, not the boy. Obi-Wan felt the words like a hand reaching past him. Yoda's ears flattened. Mace said, You will remain where you are, Chancellor. Something ancient and amused looked out of Palpatine's eyes then, not fully, not theatrically, but enough. The kindly weight of office sloughed away without any visible movement. The man before them did not become monstrous. He became simpler, more honest. Hunger without apology. Power without costume. And when he smiled again, there was no age in it at all.